Alright guys, so today we're looking at the next sentence structure, which is the complex sentence. Make sure that you have your foldable in front of you so we can fill in our notes together, and we are going to start on the top left corner where it says complex sentence structure. Here we go. Okay, so here we are looking at the structure of a complex sentence. Let's go ahead and fill in our blanks, and there is a mistake here that we're going to correct as we get to it. Alright, so our first set of notes here. The complex sentence contains, and here's where the mistake, go ahead and cross out where it says at least and write in the word only. Cross out at least and write in the word only. Here we go. The complex sentence contains only one independent clause, has one independent clause, and one or more dependent clauses. An independent clause is like that simple sentence. It's a set of words that contains a subject and a verb that completes a thought and can stand alone, so it's independent. Dependent clauses, however, also contain a subject and a verb, but they cannot stand alone because by themselves they do not form a complete thought. They leave the reader with a question. And what causes the dependent clause to not stand alone is the word that it begins with. So that's your next sentence here. Most complex sentences will contain a subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction. That subordinating conjunction is the word that causes the dependent clause to be dependent. Because of the subordinating conjunction, it's less than a complete thought. The reader will need more information to understand the complete thought because dependent clauses don't have complete thoughts. So if we're continuing our sentence family, the complex sentence is like a single independent man or a single independent woman with a dependent child or children. So it's like a single parent. Whereas the simple sentence, remember that was just your one single independent man or a single independent woman. Your compound sentence is the single independent man, two single independent men, or two single independent women, or one of each, just two independent clauses. Here our complex sentence structure is a single independent man or a single independent woman with their dependent children. Let's continue. Next we're going to identify whether a clause is dependent or independent. So here we have a set of clauses, and I'm asking you to identify if each clause is dependent or independent. If it forms a complete thought by itself, it is independent. If there's not a complete thought, you're left with a question, it's dependent. But notice every single clause contains a subject and a verb. It's just whether or not that clause can stand by itself. So let's look at a few together, then you're on your own. The dogs began barking. Okay, that's a complete thought. I don't need any more information there. Dogs is the subject, began is the verb. The dogs began barking. So go ahead and label that with an I or an IND for independent. Look at the next one. When the car passed the house. If you think about it, you're left wondering, what happened when the car passed the house? Did the house explode? I don't know, because there's not a complete thought there. Notice the first word is the word when. With that word there, that's that subordinating conjunction. With that subordinating conjunction, when, we no longer have a completed thought. When the car passed the house, what happened? So that is dependent. Go ahead and label that DEP. Okay? Pause the video here, read through the rest of the clauses, and see how well you did. When you're ready to begin and check your work, press play. Okay, let's go over and see the answers to the rest of these clauses. Before the man crossed the street, that is dependent. A truck came barreling around the corner, independent. Although the weather was warm, dependent. Sarah wore a sweater to cover her shoulders, independent. Because you did not do your homework, dependent. You may not pass the quiz in class today, independent. We left the game early, independent. So that we could beat the traffic out of the lot, dependent. Unless the mailman comes soon, dependent. I won't be able to send the package today. Independent. We bought the packaged sauces and dips. Independent. After we tasted them in the store. Dependent. Okay? Next we're going to look at what those subordinating conjunctions are. So, if you remember, in that list of clauses, there were certain words that caused a clause to become dependent, and those are the subordinating conjunctions. Here is the list of the most common subordinating conjunctions, and this is why we call them the awubis. Is after, although, as, when, while, until, unless, before, because, if, since, and so that. The ones highlighted in red are the ones you need to be especially careful of because they could also be prepositions. So why don't you, on your foldable, go ahead and put stars next to those 5. Go ahead and draw a star next to after, as, until, before, and since. Remember that a clause has a subject and a verb. A prepositional phrase does not. So whenever you come across these words, you have to think a little harder. Is this a dependent clause or is it a prepositional phrase? Does it have a subject and a verb or does it just have the preposition, object, and modifiers? One more thing you want to be careful of is the subordinating conjunction so that. If so stands by itself, it's a fanboy, a coordinating conjunction with compound sentences. So that is the subordinating conjunction with complex sentences. We call these the awubis because of the first letters, A, W, W, U, U, B, B, I, S, S. Awubis. Go ahead and say it. Your parents will think you're crazy. Awubis. 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 Yeah, okay, that's enough. So on this slide, we are looking at whether one of those awubis words is actually a subordinating conjunction or a preposition, depending on whether there's a subject and a verb after them. Let's do the first couple together, and then you're on your own. Okay, since that dreadful day. Well, I see the word since. That's one of the subordinating conjunctions, but it could also be a preposition. So let's see what's after it. That dreadful day. I don't see a verb. So that tells me that this is a prepositional phrase, which means that since in this particular group of words is being used as a preposition. So go ahead and label that prep. Okay, let's look at the next one. Before, there's that key word that can be a conjunction or a preposition. So our whole group of words is before the game started. Well, I can see that game would be a subject and started is a verb, which makes this one a dependent clause, which means that before is not a preposition. In this case, it's a subordinating conjunction. Go ahead and label that with an SC. Okay, 2 more. After the clouds blew away. Well, there's the key word after, which is one of those words that can be a subordinating conjunction or a preposition. So now we have to determine, is there a subject and a verb following them or not? The clouds blew away. Well, clouds can be a subject and blew is a verb. So that means that after is acting as a subordinating conjunction because that is a clause, not a prepositional phrase. Okay, let's look at the next one. As a funny looking clown. Okay, the subordinating conjunction or preposition is as. Let's see if we can find a subject and a verb. A funny looking clown. Well, clown could be a subject, but there's no verb. The clown is not doing anything here. So this is a prepositional phrase, which means that as is functioning as a preposition. Go ahead and look through the rest of them. If you find a subject and a verb, it's a subordinating conjunction. If you do not, then that word is acting as a preposition. Label them, pause the video here, and then play when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, let's see how well we did. Until the game day party. No verb, so until is a preposition. Before the exciting movie. No verb, so before is a preposition. After my birthday party. No verb, so after is a preposition. As the fish swam. Swam is a verb, fish is a subject, so as is a subordinating conjunction, and that is a dependent clause. Since my mom was late. Mom is a subject and was is a verb, so since is a subordinating conjunction in that dependent clause. Until we know the answer. Okay, we is a subject and know is a verb, so this word until is acting as a subordinating conjunction in this dependent clause. As the substitute teacher. There's no verb. That's a prepositional phrase. So as is a preposition. After the rain delayed the game. Rain can be a subject. Delayed is a verb. So after is a subordinating conjunction, and that is a dependent clause. Before he told me the secret. He is a subject. Told is the verb. Before is a subordinating conjunction, and that is a dependent clause. So as you see, you have to be careful about those 5 words. They can be subordinating conjunctions or prepositions depending on how they're being used in that sentence. So let's move on. Now that you understand how a complex sentence is formed with the one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses, and you're able to identify the difference between dependent and independent clauses, and you recognize those subordinating conjunctions, let's put it all together and look at how the complex sentence structure is actually interchangeable. Here we go. In a complex sentence, the order of the clauses is interchangeable, meaning the dependent clause can come before or after the independent clause. So when you write a complex sentence, it really doesn't matter which clause comes first or second. However, there is a rule that you must follow. It says, however, if you begin a sentence with a dependent clause, so if your dependent clause is first, meaning that your awubis word would be the very first word, you must use a comma to separate the 2 clauses. Just check to see if the subordinating conjunction is the first word. So when you begin a sentence, a complex sentence, with a subordinating conjunction, that means that your dependent clause is first, and then after that dependent clause, you have to have a comma to separate it from your independent clause. But if you begin with the independent clause and your conjunction is in the middle of your sentence, separating your 2 clauses, that's okay. You do not need a comma in that case. Let's look at what these would look like. Okay, here I'm going to ask you to circle the subordinating conjunctions and commas to notice the sentence patterns. I'd also like you to underline the dependent clause in the sentence. Let's do a couple of these together before you're on your own. Kelly will go to the new school until the family moves. First things first, identify the subordinating conjunction. So which word in the sentence is the subordinating conjunction? You have your list in front of you, and you should be able to recognize that it is the word until. So go ahead and circle until, which means that the dependent clause in this sentence is at the end. Go ahead and underline that dependent clause, until the family moves. So if you notice, in this case, the independent clause, Kelly will go to the new school, is at the beginning of the sentence. So there is no need for a comma. The word until is already joining our clauses together. Kelly will go to the new school until the family moves. There's not a necessary need for a pause right there, so there's no need for a comma when your dependent clause is at the end. Let's look at number 2, though. After the rain flooded the streets, the drains were clogged. Okay? Go ahead and see if you can identify where the subordinating conjunction is and circle it. It is the word after. So in this case, since the subordinating conjunction is the first word of our complex sentence, that tells us that our dependent clause is first. So underline that dependent clause. After the rain flooded the streets. After the rain flooded the streets. And we know it's dependent because we're left thinking, well, what happened after the rain flooded the streets? But the rest of our complex sentence tells us that. The drains were clogged. In this case, there's a need for a pause between the 2 clauses. So when you begin with your dependent clause, you have to pause with a comma between your dependent and independent clause. After the rain flooded the streets, the drains were clogged. Put a star or circle or somehow identify that comma that is there. That tells you there has to be a comma when you begin with a subordinating conjunction. Go ahead and try the next 4 on your own. Circle the subordinating conjunction. Underline the dependent clause, and notice if there is a comma there or not, and really kind of internalize the structure of the complex sentence, the 2 different possibilities of how you would put complex sentences together. Pause the video here, try the 4, and then we'll go over them. Okay, number 3. Because it's a subordinating conjunction, Because we rarely visit her is your dependent clause. And since we start with our dependent clause, there's a comma separating the dependent clause from the independent clause. Because we rarely visit her, pause, we FaceTime with mom often. We usually do that at dinner while Mason is eating his food, while he's strapped in that chair and he can't run away from Mima on the screen. Okay, anyway, number 4. The dogs were frisky since they saw a squirrel in the tree. Since is the subordinating conjunction, which makes since they saw a squirrel in the tree the dependent clause. And notice, when we begin the sentence with the independent clause, the dogs were frisky, we do not need a pause, we do not need a comma. Number 5. As the bus entered the driveway, Mason waved to the driver. As is the subordinating conjunction, which means that as the bus entered the driveway is our dependent clause. And since we begin the sentence with the dependent clause, we have a comma separating our two clauses. Number 6. The car needs an oil change because I drove many miles. Because is the subordinating conjunction. Because I drove many miles is the dependent clause. No comma needed, since we begin our sentence with our independent clause. Take a moment to look at these two different ways of combining clauses together to make complex sentences. Okay, this is the end of today's notes. Make sure that you bring your foldable to class so we can practice and glue it into the writer's notebook. See you tomorrow.